Hello, and welcome to Dreamwoven History. Tonight, perhaps you will drift into dreams and find yourself walking among the pages of the past. Every word you hear will be gentle, and every moment unhurried, until history itself feels like a soft blanket around your thoughts. Let the sound of the rain into another time. And now, we begin the quiet journey into the history of the lost settlements of the North.
It was in that year that Eric the Red stood on the deck of his ship. Behind him lay Iceland, and before him an uncharted shore. The voyage had not been made in a spirit of peace. Eric had been exiled from Iceland for 3 years after a violent feud. But instead of fading into obscurity, he sailed west, following the tales of land beyond the sea. What he found was a coast, rugged and green, at least in summer. He called it Greenland, a name chosen to entice others to follow. Within 2 years, the first settlers arrived. They came in 25 ships, carrying families, livestock, and everything needed to carve life from the wilderness. Only 14 ships survived the crossing, the others lost to storms and ice. Those who landed established what came to be called the Eastern Settlement in the sheltered fjords of southern Greenland. Here, the grass was thick in summer, enough for sheep and cattle. The sea was rich with seals, fish, and the occasional walrus prized for its ivory. In the early years, life was not easy. Winters were long, and the darkness seemed to stretch forever. But the settlers built, in the way of their Norse ancestors, long houses of stone and turf, warm with the smoke of fires. Fields were fenced, hay was cut, and churches rose from the rocky ground. By the mid-11th century, the settlement thrived. Trade ships came from Iceland and Norway, bringing iron tools, timber, and fine cloth in exchange for furs, wool, and walrus ivory. From the shores of Greenland, Norse explorers pushed farther west. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed to a land he called Vinland, now believed to be Newfoundland. For a brief moment, Norse sails touched the North American coast centuries before Columbus. But Greenland remained their farthest permanent outpost. Here, for nearly 500 years, generations were born, lived and died beneath the same northern sky. Yet even in its strength, the seeds of decline were already present. The climate would shift, the seas would grow harsher, and the world beyond Greenland would change. In our next part, we will see how the Norse foothold began to falter. After the first winter had passed, the settlers of the Eastern Settlement began to settle into a rhythm. The snow that had seemed endless began to melt away, revealing dark, rocky ground dotted with stubborn green moss and grass. The fjords that had been locked in ice now shimmered with open water. Seabirds returned, filling the air with their cries, and seals could be seen basking on the rocky shores. Eric the Red remained the central figure in the settlement. His longhouse was the largest, its turf walls thick and weathered, its roof heavy with sod and grass. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of wood smoke, and the faint aroma of dried fish hung from rafters above. Here the settlers gathered to speak of their plans for the year, their hopes and their worries. The first priority was food. The settlers had brought livestock from Iceland, cattle, sheep, and goats, carefully transported in the holds of ships. In the short Greenland summer, they turned the animals loose in small grassy valleys where they could graze before winter's return. Men and women worked side by side, cutting sod, building pens, and preparing small fields for barley and hay.
The soil was thin. It was not like the deep earth of Norway, nor the familiar farmlands of Iceland. It was stubborn, rocky, and in many places laced with salt from the sea winds. But the Norse were patient. They knew how to coax life from the ground, how to store what could not be eaten at once, and how to prepare for the lean months to come. Hunting was just as important as farming. Greenland's waters were rich with seals, and sometimes, with luck, walrus. Seal meat was eaten fresh in summer, or dried and smoked for the long winter. Their skins became boots, ropes, and coverings for boats. The walrus was a prize beyond food alone. Its ivory tusks could be carved into ornaments, chess pieces, and religious artifacts, prized across Europe. In the early years, trade was the settlement's lifeline. Each summer, ships from Iceland, and sometimes from Norway, arrived in the fjords. They brought iron for tools, wood for building, and fine cloth for clothing. In return, the Greenlanders offered walrus ivory, sealskins, and occasionally rare polar bear pelts. Life was hard, but it was also bound together by community. In the evenings, after the day's work, neighbors would gather in the warmth of a longhouse. There, by the glow of the central fire, they shared stories from the old sagas, news from distant lands, and plans for the coming seasons. Children learned to carve, to spin wool, to watch the skies for weather changes. These skills were not just tradition, they were survival. Yet, beneath the steady rhythm of life, there were shadows. The winters were longer than in Iceland, and the cold seemed to bite deeper. Storms sometimes trapped ships in harbor, and some years no ship came at all. A poor harvest could mean hunger. A ship lost to a storm could mean no new iron for tools, no new timber for repairs. There were also tensions with the land's original people, the Inuit, who had their own way of life in Greenland's harsh climate. At first, encounters were rare and often peaceful, but misunderstandings could turn dangerous. The Norse and Inuit hunted many of the same animals, and in years of scarcity, competition could lead to conflict. Still, the settlers pressed on. Generations began to grow in Greenland. Children who had never seen Iceland, never known Norway. For them, Greenland was home. Its jagged mountains, its wide, cold fjords, the endless stretch of ice to the north, all of it was familiar and dear. The settlement began to spread. New farmsteads were built along sheltered valleys. Turf churches rose in the heart of communities, and the eastern settlement became a small but thriving Norse world. Priests came from Iceland to serve the faithful, bringing with them books, candles, and news from the wider world. Faith was a quiet anchor in the lives of the settlers, a reminder that even in the farthest reaches of the known world, they were not forgotten. And so, year after year, the Greenlanders worked the land, sailed the fjords, and traded with the outside world when the seas allowed. They endured the storms, the cold, and the distance from their ancestral homes. They built a life in a place that, to most people of their time, was only a rumor or a distant mark on a map. But time has a way of testing even the strongest communities, and though the Norse in Greenland did not yet know it, challenges greater than storms or hunger were slowly approaching on the horizon of history.
By the middle of the 13th century, the Norse of Greenland had lived here for generations. The names of the first settlers were now only spoken in sagas, their descendants knowing this icy coast as their only home. They had endured, adapted, and even thrived in ways their ancestors might have thought impossible. But the world beyond Greenland was changing.
And slowly, the ripple of those changes began to reach across the sea. The first sign came with the weather. There were winters that felt colder than any before. The ice on the fjords grew thicker, and it lingered longer into spring. In some years, the sea ice clung to the coast well into the sailing season, trapping ships and delaying the arrival of traders from Iceland. No one in Greenland could have known it at the time, but the North Atlantic was slipping into what history would call the Little Ice Age, a slow but relentless cooling that would tighten its grip for centuries to come. At first, the changes were subtle. A shorter growing season here and there, a few more storms than usual. But each year that the crops failed early meant less hay for the animals and less food for the people. Families began to slaughter some of their livestock before winter simply because they could not feed them all. In the past, poor harvests could be eased by trade. But as the climate shifted, the same storms and ice that hurt the farms also made the sea more dangerous. There were more years when the ships did not come at all, when the wind stayed against them, or ice blocked their path, or the captains decided the risk was simply too great. Without trade, life grew harder. Iron tools, once replaced as needed, now had to be repaired again and again until they were almost useless. Cloth from Europe, once a mark of comfort and status, grew threadbare and was patched with whatever scraps could be found. Even salt became rare, forcing families to rely on smoking and drying meat instead of preserving it in brine. It was not only nature that brought shadows to Greenland. The political heart of the Norse world, Norway, was asserting its power more strongly over distant lands. Greenland became a part of the Norwegian crown's trade monopoly, meaning they could only trade through official channels and at official prices. For an isolated settlement, this meant less freedom and fewer chances to get the goods they needed. And beyond their fjords, new dangers moved silently. Across the sea in North America, the people the Norse called Skraelings, the Inuit, had always been present on the fringes of their world. In earlier times, contact had been rare, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not. But as the Norse pushed farther for hunting, and as the Inuit expanded their range southward, the two peoples crossed paths more often. These encounters were not always friendly. There are tales of skirmishes along the coast, of arrows striking from the fog, and of Norse hunters returning home wounded. To the Inuit, the fjords were theirs to fish and hunt. To the Norse, these same waters had been part of their home for generations. Conflict was perhaps inevitable. And yet, in the long houses at night, the old traditions continued. The sagas were still told, voices low over the sound of rain on the roof. Children listened to stories of Eric the Red, of Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland, of the first farms in Greenland. Faith remained strong, and the church still marked the seasons with its rituals and festivals. But there was an unspoken feeling growing year by year, a quiet sense that the world was shifting, that the balance between the Norse and this harsh land was no longer as steady as it had once been. In the eastern settlement, some families began to talk of moving, either to the western settlement or even back to Iceland. For many, this was only talk. Their homes, their memories, their entire lives were here. But for a few, the decision was made. Boats were loaded and they sailed away, leaving empty farmhouses behind. Those who remained worked harder than ever to hold on. They hunted more seals in winter, fished more in summer, and carefully rationed every store of grain. They cut peat for fuel and mended their clothing until it was little more than patchwork. The ships still came some years, and when they did, the whole settlement came alive. Goods were exchanged, news was shared, and for a brief time, Greenland felt connected to the wider Norse world again. But when the ships failed to come, the silence of isolation pressed in harder than ever. The younger generation, who had never seen Norway, began to see it as almost mythical. They knew its name, its kings, its great churches, but to them it was a place of stories, not of personal memory. And so Greenland moved into the latter part of the 13th century, a place still alive with tradition, but now touched by uncertainty. The rain still fell on the rooftops. The wind still howled down the fjords, but in the shadows of that sound, a quiet truth was beginning to take root, that survival here might no longer be certain. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Norse of Greenland were entering a new chapter, one darker than any before. The winters were no longer just long, they were brutal, and the summers felt more like the winters of old. It was no longer possible to pretend that these were just unlucky years. The growing season had shortened so much that some fields yielded almost nothing. The hay that once grew tall in summer now came in thin and patchy, leaving too little to feed the cattle and sheep through the winter. Families faced a grim choice: keep more animals alive and risk them starving, or slaughter them early to save resources for the few that could be kept. The sound of axes in the barn, the low cries of animals, became part of autumn's rhythm. Hunting took on a new urgency. Men pushed farther out to sea, braving storms and drifting ice to hunt seal and walrus. The meat fed the families. The hides and ivory were their best chance to trade for desperately needed goods. But each journey carried risk. The sea could swallow boats in an instant, and more than one hunting party never returned. The ice itself seemed to be closing in. Where once the fjords froze lightly, now they became solid walls of white, cutting the settlements off from the ocean for months. Even in summer, the pack ice sometimes lingered offshore, a silent barrier turning ships away. And so, the visits from Iceland and Norway became fewer and fewer. 1 year without a ship was difficult. 2 years was dangerous. But there were whispers of 5 years without any ship sighted at all. The absence of trade began to erode the Norse way of life in Greenland. Iron became almost priceless. A broken axe head might be reforged again and again until it was little more than a stub of metal. Clothing wore thin, patched with sealskin or rough homespun wool. Even the church, which had once been richly adorned, began to lose its finery. Candles grew scarce, silver chalices were tarnished, and sometimes the priest's vestments were mended more than they were whole. Yet faith endured. In the long, dark winters, the glow of the church still drew the people together. They sang hymns against the sound of the wind. They prayed for the ships to return, for the ice to break, for warmth to come back to their fields. But the world beyond Greenland was not listening. The little ice age was deepening. Storms grew fiercer, the seas less forgiving. And the Norse were not the only ones feeling the change. The Inuit, too, were adapting to the colder climate. Their skills in hunting sea mammals, in building shelters of snow and skin, gave them an edge in the frozen world. They began to appear more often in the fjords near the Norse settlements. Sometimes they traded. Sometimes they simply watched from the distance. And sometimes there was blood. Stories spread of Norse hunters who vanished without a trace, of arrows found lodged in the timbers of boats, of sled tracks leading away from abandoned camps. The truth was often hard to know, but the fear was real. For some, the answer was to retreat inward. Farmers stayed closer to home. Boats hugged the coastline rather than venturing far out into the open sea. But for others, survival meant taking more risks than ever before. There were hunts deep into the north where walrus ivory could still be found in abundance. Those who returned came back with wealth. Those who didn't were never seen again. In the eastern settlement, the largest community in Greenland, the mood began to shift. Once, the people had seen themselves as part of the Norse world, linked to Iceland, Norway, and even to Europe itself. Now, they were beginning to feel apart from it. The stories from the outside world grew older, less relevant. Children were born, grew up, and had children of their own without ever seeing a ship from across the sea. The western settlement, smaller and more remote, suffered even more. When ships did come, they often stopped at the eastern settlement first and brought little for the west. There were rumors that some farms in the western settlement had been abandoned entirely, that the people there had either moved east or vanished altogether. But still, the Norse endured. They cut more peat for fuel. They fished through holes in the ice. They dried seaweed for food when the larder ran low. It was not the life their ancestors had dreamed of, but it was life. And then, in the middle of this hardship, a rare moment of hope. A ship was sighted in the fjord. It had been years since the last one. The settlement gathered at the shore, waving, shouting as the vessel drew closer. When it docked, people pressed forward, eager for news, for supplies, for the feeling of connection to the greater world. But the ship's captain brought troubling news. Norway itself was facing its own struggles. The climate was changing there too. Fewer ships could be spared for Greenland, and with the growing monopoly on trade, the prices for goods had risen sharply. The joy of the ship's arrival was tempered by the reality that it might be a long time before another came. The Norse of Greenland were still standing, but the winters were winning, and in the long silence between the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind, some wondered if the ice would ever release them. By the mid-14th century, a silence began to grow from the western fjords. It started as a rumor. Hunters from the eastern settlement said they had passed through the lands of the western settlement and seen no smoke from the longhouses, no footprints in the snow. At first, the people of the east told themselves it was simply winter, that the westerners were huddled inside waiting for the ice to loosen its grip. But as seasons passed and no one came from the west, the unease deepened. Finally, a small party was sent to see what had become of them. They traveled across the frozen inlets, past familiar landmarks, into the quiet fjords of the west. And there they found the truth. Farms stood empty, doors hung open, tools lay scattered on the ground as if dropped mid-task. Inside the longhouses, there was nothing. No food, no clothing, no signs of a struggle, only dust and silence. The western settlement was gone. No bodies were found, no graves disturbed. It was as if the people had simply walked away, leaving everything behind. In the eastern settlement, the news struck like a cold wind.
Some said the Westerners had starved and those who survived had fled into the wilderness. Others whispered that the Inuit had driven them out, or worse. And a few feared something more supernatural, that God had turned his face from Greenland and the West had been taken in judgment. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the East was now alone. The disappearance of the Western settlement was more than a mystery. It was a warning. The same cold, the same shortages, the same isolation that had claimed the West was pressing harder against the East. Livestock numbers fell each year. Some families gave up keeping cattle altogether, relying only on goats and sheep, which could survive on less. The fields yielded less barley, and some went unplanted. In good years, there was still bread. In bad years, there was only fish, seal, and whatever could be scavenged from the sea. The church continued to stand, its walls strong against the wind, but even here, the change could be felt. Marriages became rarer, baptisms fewer, and funerals more common. Trade ships from Norway became so rare that their arrival was almost a miracle. When they did come, the joy was brief. Supplies were limited, prices high. Some years, the settlers had nothing left to trade but walrus ivory, and even that fetched less than it once had. The climate continued its slow, tightening grip. Sea ice lingered longer each spring and returned earlier each autumn. Hunters reported that even the animals seemed fewer, as if the cold had driven them elsewhere. And yet, life went on. Children played in the snow, chasing each other between the houses. Fishermen still set their nets beneath the ice. The longhouses still filled with the smell of stews and the sound of stories on winter nights. But there was an unspoken knowledge shared by everyone. The land was no longer theirs in the same way. It had turned, and they were living now at its mercy. A few families began to speak quietly of leaving, of finding passage on one of the rare ships and returning to Iceland or Norway. But leaving Greenland was no simple thing. Passage was costly, and there was no guarantee a ship would return to carry them away. So most stayed, not out of hope, but because Greenland was all they had ever known. Their parents were buried here. Their children were born here. This was home. And yet, in the long silence after a day's work, many must have wondered if they would share the fate of the West.
After the first winter had passed, the settlers of the eastern settlement began to settle into a rhythm. The snow that had seemed endless began to melt away, revealing dark, rocky ground, dotted with stubborn green moss and grass. The fjords that had been locked in ice now shimmered with open water. Seabirds returned, filling the air with their cries, and seals could be seen basking on the rocky shores. Eric the Red remained the central figure in the settlement. His longhouse was the largest, its turf walls thick and weathered, its roof heavy with sod and grass. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of wood smoke, and the faint aroma of dried fish hung from rafters above. Here, the settlers gathered to speak of their plans for the year, their hopes, and their worries. The first priority was food. The settlers had brought livestock from Iceland, cattle, sheep, and goats, carefully transported in the holds of ships. In the short Greenland summer, they turned the animals loose in small grassy valleys where they could graze before winter's return. Men and women worked side by side, cutting sod, building pens, and preparing small fields for barley and hay. The soil was thin. It was not like the deep earth of Norway, nor the familiar farmlands of Iceland. It was stubborn, rocky, and in many places laced with salt from the sea winds. But the Norse were patient. They knew how to coax life from the ground, how to store what could not be eaten at once, and how to prepare for the lean months to come. Hunting was just as important as farming. Greenland's waters were rich with seals, and sometimes, with luck, walrus. Seal meat was eaten fresh in summer, or dried and smoked for the long winter. Their skins became boots, ropes, and coverings for boats. The walrus was a prize beyond food alone. Its ivory tusks could be carved into ornaments, chess pieces, and religious artifacts prized across Europe. In the early years, trade was the settlement's lifeline. Each summer, ships from Iceland, and sometimes from Norway, arrived in the fjords. They brought iron for tools, wood for building, and fine cloth for clothing. In return, the Greenlanders offered walrus ivory, seal skins, and occasionally rare polar bear pelts. Life was hard, but it was also bound together by community. In the evenings, after the day's work, neighbors would gather in the warmth of a longhouse. There, by the glow of the central fire, they shared stories from the old sagas, news from distant lands, and plans for the coming seasons. Children learned to carve, to spin wool, to watch the skies for weather changes. These skills were not just tradition, they were survival. Yet, beneath the steady rhythm of life, there were shadows. The winters were longer than in Iceland, and the cold seemed to bite deeper. Storms sometimes trapped ships in harbor, and some years no ship came at all. A poor harvest could mean hunger. A ship lost to a storm could mean no new iron for tools, no new timber for repairs. There were also tensions with the land's original people, the Inuit, who had their own way of life in Greenland's harsh climate. At first, encounters were rare and often peaceful, but misunderstandings could turn dangerous. The Norse and Inuit hunted many of the same animals, and in years of scarcity, competition could lead to conflict. Still, the settlers pressed on. Generations began to grow in Greenland. Children who had never seen Iceland, never known Norway. For them, Greenland was home. Its jagged mountains, its wide, cold fjords, the endless stretch of ice to the north. All of it was familiar and dear. The settlement began to spread. New farmsteads were built along sheltered valleys. Turf churches rose in the heart of communities, and the eastern settlement became a small but thriving Norse world. Priests came from Iceland to serve the faithful, bringing with them books, candles, and news from the wider world. Faith was a quiet anchor in the lives of the settlers, a reminder that even in the farthest reaches of the known world, they were not forgotten. And so, year after year, the Greenlanders worked the land, sailed the fjords, and traded with the outside world when the seas allowed. They endured the storms, the cold, and the distance from their ancestral homes. They built a life in a place that, to most people of their time, was only a rumor or a distant mark on a map. But time has a way of testing even the strongest communities. And though the Norse in Greenland did not yet know it, challenges greater than storms or hunger were slowly approaching on the horizon of history. By the early 1400s, the eastern settlement was a shadow of what it had been. The memory of the western settlement's disappearance still lingered, like a ghost that no one dared to speak of too often. People went about their lives, but always with the quiet knowledge that their world was shrinking. The winters had grown longer, the summers shorter. Even the warmest days now carried a sharp wind from the sea. Fields that once gave barley and hay now lay fallow,
or yielded barely enough to feed a few animals through the cold months. The hunters, once able to count on seals, caribou, and seabirds, found themselves returning empty-handed more often. The seals were fewer. The caribou seemed to have moved inland, beyond reach. Birds no longer nested in the same cliffs. And when the hunters did return with food, it was guarded fiercely. It was not just the cold, but the ice itself that closed in. Ships from Norway, which had once come almost every year, now arrived so rarely that there were children in the settlement who had never seen one. Some ships likely turned back before reaching Greenland, trapped by pack ice drifting far south of its usual borders. Others may never have returned at all. Without trade, the settlement lost more than supplies. Iron tools wore down and could not be replaced. Nails were pulled from abandoned buildings and used again. Wool was patched and patched again until garments were more repairs than cloth. Yet, in spite of it all, the church bells still rang. On feast days, the settlers gathered in the cold stone church, their breath visible in the air. The priests still read from the same Latin texts brought from Norway generations earlier. Candles flickered in the shadows, casting light on faces lined with hardship. But hardship was turning to hunger. The year was 1408, when the last known written record from the Norse in Greenland was made. It was a wedding. A couple, Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Bjornsdottir, were married in Hvalsey Church. Those who could came from farms across the fjords, braving wind and ice-ike to attend. The day was cold, but the church was full. Laughter and song filled the air that evening, a brief echo of the old days. Yet, beneath the celebration was a sense of farewell. It is possible some already knew that this might be the last time so many would gather together. Food stores were low, trade was nearly gone, and the sea ice was closing in earlier each year. After that wedding, history falls silent. No more records, no more names, no more written words from the Norse of Greenland. But silence does not mean nothing happened. It means whatever happened was unwritten. Some historians believe famine swept the settlement, and the people starved through a winter they could not escape. Others think that small groups left, one by one, attempting to sail to Iceland or into Inuit lands. A few suggest that the last Norse married into the Inuit community, leaving no trace of themselves except in memory and bloodline. Perhaps all of these things are true. The winters would have been merciless. Imagine a long house in January, the wind rattling the door, the snow piled high against the walls. Inside, the fire burns low. The smell of smoke and hunger fills the air. The animals are gone, eaten or dead from the cold. Children sleep, wrapped in every scrap of wool and fur their families own. Outside, the land lies silent under a sky of endless darkness. If a ship came, it was not recorded. If anyone left, no one returned to tell of it. The sea ice was a prison, and the cold a slow executioner. By the time the first European ships returned to Greenland decades later, the Norse were gone. Only ruins remained, the stone walls of churches still standing against the wind, the outlines of farms fading back into the earth. No human bones were found, suggesting they were buried or lost to the sea. The last winter, may not have been one single season, but a long decline stretched across many years. A winter of the heart, where hope faded and life narrowed until there was nothing left to hold on to. And so the story of the Norse in Greenland ended not with a battle or a dramatic disaster, but with absence, a quiet, cold, and final disappearance beneath the falling snow. When the Norse of Greenland vanished, the world beyond hardly noticed. Europe was far away, caught in its own troubles. Wars raged, kingdoms rose and fell. The seas between Greenland and Norway were as much a barrier as the cold itself. It was not until decades later that European sailors returned to these shores. They expected to find the familiar: stone churches, farms with cattle in the fields, smoke curling from the roofs of longhouses. Instead, they found silence. The eastern settlement, once the heart of Norse life in Greenland, was empty. Cattle pens stood broken, doors hung open, swinging in the wind. In the churches, the altars were bare, the candles long gone. The air inside smelled of dust and sea salt, as if the ocean had reached in to claim the land. Some houses still held traces of life: a comb carved from bone, a spindle for spinning wool, a wooden spoon left beside a hearth gone cold. But the people were gone. No graves freshly dug, no signs of fire or battle, only absence. For centuries, no one knew exactly when or how they had left, and so theories grew. One theory tells of famine. The Little Ice Age had gripped the North Atlantic. The seas froze earlier, trapping ships in ice before they could reach harbor. Snow buried the pastures, starving the cattle. The people, trapped by weather and distance, may have simply starved, too few and too weak to survive another winter. Another theory speaks of violence. The Norse and the Inuit lived in neighboring lands for centuries. Most evidence suggests their contact was peaceful or cautious, but some historians wonder if tensions over hunting grounds or dwindling resources ever turned to conflict. If it did, there is little proof. Only a few broken arrowheads found near Norse sites. A third possibility is migration. Some believe small groups of Norse left quietly. Perhaps they sailed south, hoping to reach Iceland or Norway. Perhaps they traveled inland into Inuit territory and were absorbed into their communities. If so, they would have left behind their stone houses, their heavy farming tools, taking only what they could carry. The Inuit themselves tell stories passed down through generations. Some speak of tall strangers who came from across the sea, wearing strange clothes and building houses of stone. In some versions, the strangers traded with the Inuit. In others, they disappeared into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Archaeologists have searched for answers. They have found bones of cattle and sheep showing signs of malnutrition in the final years. They have found abandoned fields overrun with moss and lichen. They have found graves older than the last written records, but none that explain the very end. One haunting discovery was made in the ruins of a small farmstead. A single human tooth, worn down with age, resting on the floor near the hearth. No other human remains were found nearby. It is as if the last occupant simply walked out into the snow and never returned. Some scientists turned to climate data for clues. Ice core samples taken from Greenland's glaciers show sudden drops in temperature in the 14th and 15th centuries.
These shifts would have shortened growing seasons and made hunting at sea more dangerous. Even the best prepared community could have struggled to adapt. Yet the mystery remains. If the Norse all died in place, where are their final graves? If they left, why is there no record from Iceland or Norway of their arrival? If they joined the Inuit, why is there so little archaeological evidence of that blending? Perhaps part of the answer lies in the very nature of Greenland. It is a place where the land and sea can hide almost anything. Snow covers ruins for centuries. Ice swallows ships whole. Stories vanish in the long, dark winters. In the end, the disappearance of the Norse in Greenland is not just a tale of survival or loss. It is a reminder of how fragile human settlements can be when faced with the slow, unrelenting power of nature. No great army came to conquer them. No single disaster wiped them out. It was time, cold, and isolation that ended their chapter in history. And yet, if you stand today among the ruins of Hvalsey Church and listen, you might imagine the voices of the past, the wedding guests laughing in the cold air, the ring of the church bell, the creak of a wooden door in the wind. Then, nothing. Only the rain, only the snow, only the whispers in the wind carrying away the memory of those who once called this frozen land home. The disappearance of the Norse in Greenland was not an ending, but a quiet ripple that traveled far beyond the ice. For centuries in Europe, the settlement was remembered only in passing, a line in a monk's chronicle, a mention in a sailor's tale. Few cared to ask what became of them. After all, Greenland was distant, costly to reach, and poor in riches. But the human mind cannot leave a mystery alone forever. In the great halls of Iceland, storytellers spoke of the Greenland men. Some said they were lost to famine. Others claimed they sailed west into an unknown land, never to return. In these tales, the Norse became ghosts, traveling forever between worlds. By the 16th century, as Europe entered the age of exploration, whispers of Greenland returned. Sailors, chasing the promise of the Northwest Passage, began to wonder, could the Greenland Norse have reached that passage centuries before? Could they have sailed further west to lands across the sea? Some maps drawn in this era hint at strange coastlines somewhere west of Greenland. Were these the echoes of old Norse voyages? Or were they nothing more than rumor, sketched into the parchment dreams of cartographers? In Denmark and Norway, scholars began searching the royal archives. They found letters from bishops in Iceland written hundreds of years earlier, pleading for aid to the Greenland Christians who had fallen into hardship. But no help had come. The letters were unanswered. The silence had already claimed them. The Inuit kept their own memories. In some oral histories, they spoke of Kavdul Night, people from across the sea who built houses that never moved, even when the seasons changed. The Inuit took their iron nails, their wood, and their stories into their own way of life. To them, the Norse were neither friend nor enemy, but simply another people who had come and gone. By the 18th century, European missionaries and traders returned to Greenland's fjords. They found Inuit families living where Norse farms had once stood. They stood in Hvalsey Church, the roof long gone, grass growing between the stones, and they wondered how could such strong walls be left to the wind. The mystery began to grow in the minds of historians. Some saw the Norse disappearance as a warning, a reminder that no colony, no matter how skilled or determined, can survive if it ignores the land it depends on. Others saw romance in the story. They imagined the last ship slipping quietly from the harbor, sails full in the icy wind, heading into the unknown. Or a final group walking into the mountains, fading into the snow, their names lost, but their courage remembered. Modern archaeology has turned the mystery into a science. Excavations at Brattahlid, Gardar, and Hvalsey reveal a people skilled in farming, yet reluctant to change old ways. They clung to European crops and cattle even as the climate cooled. They hunted seals and walrus, but never fully embraced the Inuits' methods of survival. Perhaps it was this balance, or imbalance, between tradition and adaptation that sealed their fate. But even now, no single answer fits all the evidence. We are left, instead, with fragments. A broken spindle whorl, a comb worn smooth, a church that still stands, though the people are gone. And so, the Norse in Greenland live on, not in flesh, but in the spaces they left behind, in the empty doorways, in the stone walls that refuse to fall, in the quiet echo of rain on rock. Perhaps that is the true legacy. Not the farms they built, not the voyages they took, but the reminder that history is full of questions that will never be answered, and that sometimes mystery itself is the most enduring story of all. If you ever stand among those ruins, you may hear it. Not voices, not footsteps, but a presence watching from the edges of memory. A reminder that once here, at the edge of the world, people lived, people dreamed, and then they were gone. We have walked together through the fjords of Greenland. We have stood in the shadows of broken walls. We have listened for the voices of those who are gone. And now the journey must end. The Norse of Greenland were not kings, nor conquerors of empires. They were farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, traders, people who lived at the edge of what was known, at the edge of what was possible. They carried their homes, their language, their faith across a vast and dangerous sea. They built farms from frozen earth. They raised cattle in a land where grass was precious. They prayed in stone churches while winter storms howled outside. For centuries they endured. Generation after generation, they worked the same fields, sailed the same waters, kept the same traditions. They were not a people who gave up easily. But even the strongest roots can be broken. The climate changed. The seas froze longer. Trade ships stopped coming, and the world they had built began to slip away. Some may have died quietly in their homes. Some may have sailed away, chasing a hope beyond the horizon. Some may have walked into the mountains, following paths that no one remembered. And some, perhaps, were taken into the lives of the Inuit, their stories merging until they could no longer be told apart. We will never know. The ruins still stand. Hvalsey Church, its walls unbroken, though its roof has long fallen. The foundations of homes filled now with grass and stone. The shapes of old fields still marked on the land, though no one has worked them in hundreds of years. When the rain falls, as it falls now, you can imagine them. A woman hanging fish to dry. A man repairing a net beside the fire. Children running across the wet grass, their laughter lost in the wind. All of it gone. History often remembers the great battles, the rise and fall of empires. But there is another kind of history, one made not of armies, but of lives quietly lived. And it is this history that slips away most easily, unless we choose to remember. The Norse in Greenland may be gone, but their story is not only about loss, it is about courage, about hope in the face of cold seas and long winters, about the will to build in a place the world called unlivable. It is about the truth that sometimes survival means changing, and sometimes it means letting go. Their story is a reminder to us that the world we know is never permanent, that even the strongest walls can crumble, and that the only way to truly disappear is to be forgotten. We have not forgotten. So, if one night you find yourself far from the city lights, with the wind cold on your face, listen. Perhaps across the water, you will hear the sound of oars. Perhaps you will see a shape on the shore, a flicker of torchlight in the dark. And you will know that the past never truly leaves us. It waits quietly, like the stones of an old church, holding the memory of a people who lived, who dreamed, who are still watching. This is the last light of the Greenland Norse, not extinguished, only carried away into the deep night.
History is not silent. It whispers. It carries voices across centuries, across oceans. When we stand among the ruins of the Greenland Norse, we are not simply looking at stones. We are looking into the lives of people who stood exactly where we stand now. Imagine the sound of the sea crashing against the cliffs. Imagine the creak of wooden ships tied to a small dock, bobbing in the cold water. Imagine the low voices of men discussing the voyage ahead, their words carried away by the wind. The Norse were part of a world far larger than Greenland itself. Their ships carried goods to Iceland, to Norway, to the far reaches of Europe. They traded walrus ivory, narwhal tusks, furs, and rope made from walrus hide. In return, they brought back tools, weapons, cloth, salt, and dreams from places their children would never see. But trade is as fragile as the ships that carry it. One by one, the routes became harder, the voyages more dangerous. The seas grow colder, storms came earlier and stayed longer. And slowly the great web of connection frayed. In the final decades, a journey to Norway became a desperate gamble. Few ships returned. Those that did brought news not of hope, but of hardship across the sea. And so the Norse of Greenland turned inward. They still built their homes, tended their fields, raised their animals. But now they looked less to the sea and more to the land, to survive from what little the earth could give. Yet the earth was changing. Summers grew shorter. The grass that fed their cattle grew thinner, more brittle. Snow lingered longer into spring, and frost came earlier each autumn. We can read the climate records. We can study the soil. We can map the changes. But they lived it. Each season a little harder. Each winter a little longer. And all the while they kept their traditions. They built churches, even as their numbers dwindled. They held feasts, even when the food was scarce. They passed down stories that might never be told beyond their own shores. But traditions are heavy. And sometimes, when the weight is too great, people choose to lay them down. What happened then? We can only guess. Some may have turned fully to the ways of the Inuit, adopting their skills, their tools, their way of life. Some may have resisted, clinging to the old ways until the last. Some may have simply walked away. And in that leaving, they became echoes. The world does not remember every name, but it remembers shapes. It remembers patterns. It remembers the way a roof beam fits into stone, or how a path curves toward the water. And if you go there now, and you stand in that place, and you listen long enough, you might hear those echoes. Not words, not songs, but the rhythm of a life that once was. The Greenland Norse are a reminder that a culture can live and breathe for centuries and then vanish without a single war or a final battle to mark its end. They did not fall in fire and blood. They faded in rain and snow and silence. But silence is not the same as nothing. The silence holds their memory. And so, we speak of them now. We remember what can be remembered. We honor what they built, what they endured, and what they became when the sea no longer carried them home. History is full of echoes, and some are worth following, no matter how far they lead. And so, the story of that age draws to a close. A time of shadows and of light, of hardship and quiet resilience. Thank you for walking these old roads with me tonight. May the echoes of history guide your dreams, and may you rest in the gentle company of the past. Good night, and sleep well beneath the stars of another century.